The town of Hollow's End was a quiet place, its cobblestone streets and sagging rooftops cradling a rhythm as steady as the ticking of clocks in every home. The townsfolk lived by routine, their days marked by the chime of the old church bell and the soft hum of daily life. But on a windless night, when the stars seemed to dim, something arrived. It was not heralded by sound or spectacle, but by a creeping absence, a shadow that swallowed light itself. In the town square, where the fountain stood dry and forgotten, a mass of writhing black filaments appeared, coiling like ink spilled into water. It had no shape, no edges, just an amorphous pulse that seemed to drink the moonlight, leaving the air heavy and wrong. By morning, the first signs of disturbance rippled through Hollow's End. Clocks, once reliable, began to fail. In the bakery, Mrs. Harrow stared as her antique wall clock drooped, its brass hands melting like wax, curling into grotesque spirals before dripping onto the floor. Across town, the schoolteacher, Mr. Lyle, found his pocket watch frozen, its gears twitching as if alive, then snapping into jagged, insect-like forms. The townsfolk whispered of faulty mechanisms, but the air felt thicker, as if time itself had grown sluggish, resisting its own flow. Memories began to fray. Jonas, a carpenter with hands calloused from decades of work, woke screaming, his mind flooded with images of a city in flames, a future he couldn't have seen. At the market, little Clara clutched her mother's skirt, sobbing about a life. She'd lived as an old woman, her words tumbling out in a voice too heavy for her small frame. The townsfolk tried to rationalize it, stress, illness, perhaps a gas leak, but their explanations faltered as their own minds betrayed them, mixing past, present, and impossible futures into a disorienting haze. The physical toll came next, as erratic as it was horrifying. Old Mr. Tate, who tended the town's lone gas station, collapsed in the street, his skin wrinkling and cracking like dry earth, aging decades in moments. Then, just as suddenly, his body snapped back, bones creaking as he reverted to a younger man, his eyes wide with terror. A teenage girl, Lila, ran screaming from her home, her hair falling out in clumps only to regrow in seconds, each strand writhing like a living thing. The townsfolk gathered in doorways, clutching each other, their faces pale as they witnessed their neighbors unravel in cycles of decay and renewal. The reflections were the worst. At first, they appeared in fleeting glimpses, mirrors, windows, even the still surface of a rain puddle. Jonas looked into his shop's glass door and saw not himself, but a child, with his eyes, hollow and ancient, staring back. Mrs. Harrow, washing dishes, froze as her kitchen window showed a version of her with skin peeled back, exposing muscle that pulsed with black veins. The reflections weren't static. They moved, sometimes crawling out of the glass, their forms distorted, limbs too long, faces half-melted, mouths open in silent screams. These visions didn't speak, but their presence was a violation, as if the townsfolk's very existence was being rewritten. Panic drove the townsfolk to the town hall, a squat building with peeling paint and a clock tower that now dripped molten metal. The mayor, a nervous man named Mr. Grayson, called for calm, but his voice trembled as he spoke of temporary phenomena and scientific explanations. The crowd wasn't convinced. Whispers of curses and government experiments circulated, but no one could ignore the entity in the square. It had grown, its filaments spreading like roots through the cobblestones, each thread pulsing as if alive. To look at it was to feel a pressure behind the eyes, a sense that the world was tilting toward an abyss. Dr. Ellis, the town's only scientist, a reclusive man who taught at the community college, attempted to study the entity. Armed with a Geiger counter and a spectroscope, he approached the square, his hands shaking. His instruments sparked and died, their readings spiraling. into nonsense. Negative time, infinite wavelengths, measurements that defied logic. He scribbled notes, muttering about quantum anomalies, but his words dissolved into gasps as a filament brushed his hand. His skin blistered instantly, not with heat, but with a cold that seemed to suck the warmth from his bones. He fled, his notes scattered, now illegible, the ink bleeding into meaningless patterns. By dusk, the entity's presence was undeniable. Its filaments had crept further, threading through cracks in the pavement, climbing walls like veins of some vast organism. The air buzzed with a low hum, not heard but felt, a vibration that made teeth ache and thoughts blur. The townsfolk avoided the square, but nowhere felt safe. Windows rattled without wind, and shadows moved where no light cast them. The church bell rang once, a single warped note that lingered too long, as if time itself was stretching. As night fell, the town's edges seemed to blur. Streetlights flickered, their glow consumed by the entity's light-devouring mass. The stars above Hollow's End were gone, replaced by a churning void. In the town hall, the last of the meeting dissolved into chaos as Mr. Grayson's reflection in the window began to scream, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. The crowd fled, but not before they saw the filaments slithering through the floorboards, as if the entity was reaching for them all. Jonas, standing alone in his workshop, gripped a hammer, his knuckles white. He could feel it, the unraveling of everything he knew. His reflection in a cracked mirror showed a man he didn't recognize, his face stitched together from fragments of lives he hadn't lived. The entity didn't speak, didn't need to. Its presence was a promise. Hollow's End was no longer theirs. Time itself was slipping away, and with it the very fabric of their reality. The filaments had spread beyond the town square, threading through Hollow's End like veins of a diseased heart. By the second day, the entity's presence was a suffocating weight, its black tendrils coiling around lampposts and seeping into the cracks of homes. The air pulsed with a wrongness that made skin crawl, and time itself began to fracture. Jonas, still clutching his hammer, stood outside his workshop, watching as the street warped, its cobblestones rippling as if submerged in water. Some townsfolk were trapped in loops. Mrs. Harrow relived the moment her bakery burned, flames licking her skin, only to vanish, leaving her gasping in an endless cycle. Others, like young Clara, lived entire days in minutes, her small body trembling. As she aged and regressed in a heartbeat, her screams echoing with voices not her own, the visions grew worse, no longer confined to reflections. Lila, the teenage girl, stumbled through the market, her eyes wide with horror as she saw her own corpse shambling toward her, its flesh rotting yet moving, its jaw unhinged in a silent wail. Across town, Mr. Tate, now a jittery mix of youth and age, encountered his younger self, its face half-melted, eyes bulging with black veins that pulsed like the entity's filaments. These apparitions weren't mere hallucinations. They lingered, their disfigured forms trailing the living, whispering in voices that overlapped, a cacophony of pasts and futures colliding. The townsfolk barricaded themselves in their homes, but the visions followed, seeping through walls, their grotesque shapes clawing at the edges of sanity. Escape was impossible. A group of men, led by the burly mechanic Tom, piled into a truck, desperate to flee. They drove for hours, the road, stretching endlessly, only to find themselves back at the town's edge, the welcome sign now rusted and warped, as if centuries had passed. The roads looped, bending inward like the coils of the entity itself, trapping Hollow's End in a cage of warped space. Tom's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his reflection in the rearview mirror showing a skeletal figure, its mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't his. Hope flickered briefly in the form of Mr. Lyle, the schoolteacher who gathered a group of survivors in the old elementary school. His voice, steady despite the chaos, rallied them to resist. We can fight this," he urged, his chalkboard covered in frantic diagrams of time and space, but paranoia festered. Clara's mother accused Lyle of causing the calamity, her eyes wild as she claimed to remember him from a life where he betrayed them all. Fights broke out, and the group splintered, their trust eroded by memories that didn't belong. That night, the entity spoke, not in words, but in dreams that invaded every mind in Hollow's End. The survivors saw a cosmos, vast and indifferent, stars collapsing into voids, time unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry. The entity loomed at the center, its filaments stretching across eons, consuming moments like a predator devouring flesh. They awoke screaming, their minds branded with the truth. Time was not a river but a fragile illusion, and the entity was its unmaker. Desperate, Dr. Ellis tried to fight back with science. In his makeshift lab in the school basement, he rigged a generator to power a jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse, hoping to disrupt the entity. The machine hummed, then screamed, its wires melting into blackened sludge. The room imploded, walls folding inward as if crushed by an invisible hand, leaving Dr. Ellis half buried in debris, his arm withered to bone and then restored in a grotesque cycle. His screams joined the chorus of the town's unraveling. The physical world began to collapse. The church, once a beacon of stability, aged centuries in seconds, its steeple crumbling into dust, only to reform as a twisted mockery of its former self, its stones pulsing with black veins. The town's park reverted to a primeval forest, trees gnarled and dripping with sap that smelled of decay. Homes flickered between ruin and renewal, their walls cracking and then sealing, trapping residents in cycles of destruction and rebirth. A final act of defiance came when Tom, driven by rage, rallied a group to attack the entity. Armed with shotguns and axes, they stormed the square, firing into the writhing mass. Bullets vanished into its lightless form, and axes passed through as if cutting air. The entity retaliated, its filaments lashing out, wrapping around the attackers. Their bodies twisted, merging into a single writhing mass, a grotesque fusion of limbs, faces, and screams, each man's past and future stitched together in a living nightmare. The survivors fled, their courage shattered as the entity's hum grew louder, a vibration that shook the bones of the earth. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. The entity wasn't just distorting time, it was consuming it. Memories faded, not just of individuals, but of the town itself. Street names vanished from signs, photographs turned blank, and the past became a void. Jonas, hiding in his workshop, clutched a photo of his late wife, only to watch her face dissolve into nothingness. The entity's filaments now covered half. The town, pulsing like a heartbeat, each throb erasing another fragment of reality. The survivors, scattered and broken, faced a growing dread. Hollow's End was being unmade, and they were next. The entity had consumed Hollow's End, its black filaments now a suffocating shroud over the town. They draped across rooftops, pulsed through the earth, and hung in the air like a living fog, each thread devouring light and time. The sky was gone, replaced by a churning void that pulsed with a rhythm no one could name. Jonas, one of the few still clinging to fragments of his mind, hid in his workshop, his hammer now useless, its handle warped into a spiral that burned to touch. The entity's hum was deafening, a vibration that rattled teeth and blurred vision, as if reality itself was trembling under its weight. The grotesque visions had become real. The survivors saw their other selves, past, future, and impossible, crawling from the shadows. Lila stumbled through the ruins of the market, pursued by a version of herself with skin peeled back, its exposed muscles writhing with black tendrils. Mr. Lyle, barricaded in the school, faced a doppelganger with his face, but a body stitched from countless lives. its mouths screaming in unison, a chorus of every choice he'd ever made or might have made. These abominations didn't just haunt. They merged with their counterparts, flesh melding in sickening cracks, forming hybrids that staggered through the streets, their cries a symphony of temporal agony. Memories were no longer reliable. Clara's mother, clutching a journal to preserve, her daughter's name, watched the pages dissolve into ash, the ink bleeding into nothingness, photographs in every home turned blank, faces erased as if they'd never existed. Jonas tried to recall his wife's smile, but the memory slipped away, replaced by a void that felt alive, pulsing with the same rhythm as the entity. Entire families vanished from recollection, their houses empty, their lives unwritten. The town's history was unraveling, each moment consumed by the entity's insatiable hunger. The physical world followed. Buildings flickered out of existence, replaced by patches of nothingness, voids that pulsed like wounds in reality. The church, already a ruin, collapsed entirely, its stones sucked into a black maw that left no trace. The school, Mr. Lyle's last bastion, crumbled as its walls turned to dust, then reformed as a grotesque mockery, its classrooms filled with writhing filaments. The survivors, now fewer than a dozen, gathered in the town hall, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They whispered of loved ones who no longer existed, their names lost to the void. A flicker of hope emerged when Clara, the child who'd seen too many lives, found an ancient book in the school's ruins. Its pages, inexplicably intact, spoke of a ritual to banish the devourer of moments. Mr. Lyle, desperate, rallied the group, Jonas, Clara's mother, and a handful of others, to perform it. They gathered in the town square, now a pulsating mass of filaments, and chanted words from the book, their voices trembling. They burned sage, drew sigils in the dirt, and offered tokens of their past, a locket, a ring, a child's drawing, hoping to appease or repel the entity. The air grew heavy, the filaments quivering as if responding, but the entity was no mere spirit. In their minds, it revealed its truth. A cosmic force older than stars, feeding on time to fuel an eternal cycle of creation and destruction. It didn't hate them. It didn't even see them. They were motes of dust in its vast hunger, their lives insignificant against its purpose. The ritual faltered, the sigils melting into the ground, the tokens consumed by filaments that lashed out. Like whips, Clara's mother screamed as her body aged and regressed in an instant, her form collapsing into a writhing mass of flesh and bone, indistinguishable from her other selves. The end came swiftly. The filaments surged, engulfing the square. The town hall, the survivors. Jonas swung his hammer one last time, but it dissolved in his hand, his fingers crumbling to dust. The void pulsed, swallowing light, sound, and existence itself. Hollow's end ceased to be. No buildings, no people, no memories. Where the town once stood, there was only a pulsating emptiness, a wound in reality that throbbed with the entity's rhythm. The survivors' screams lingered for a moment, then faded, erased as if they'd never been. In the aftermath, the entity lingered, its filaments retracting into its amorphous core. It had no need to stay. Hollow's end was gone, its time consumed, its reality undone. With a motion that was neither movement nor stillness, it slipped away, gliding through the cosmos to another world, another time. Somewhere, in a place yet untouched, a new town would feel the weight of its arrival. The first tick of a clock slowing, the first memory fraying. The cycle would begin again, endless and inevitable, as the entity fed on the fragile threads of existence.